can't do this on Nintendo Genesis does.
16-bit arcade action.
You can't do this on Nintendo Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis.
Does.
Genesis does.
16-bit arcade hits.
You can't do this on Nintendo Genesis does.
What Nintendo don't. The 16-bit Genesis system by Sega. Genesis does it all.
When you think of the fourth generation of home consoles, one of the first things that undoubtedly comes to mind is the sheer amount of competition and marketing banter that defined the era. While it certainly didn't invent the idea of a console war, given that Atari had its own heated competition with Mattel and Coleco, the fourth generation definitely perfected it. And no part of the competitive four-party dynamic was as big and prominent as the rivalry between Nintendo and Sega. With their rise to global superstardom in the second and third generations, Nintendo had become all but synonymous with the term video game in the 1980s, and their increasingly vice-like grip on the industry looked unbreakable. Atari had tried to compete with their Atari 7800 and SEGA systems, but failed, as did Sega with the global release of the Master System, which makes it all the more fascinating that it was Sega's second attempt, the Genesis, that finally disrupted Nintendo's monopoly. What was so special about it? Was it the system itself? The way Sega adapted from their previous failures? Or was it the circumstances of its launch? It was all of this and more, actually, and I'm finally ready to take you all into another deep dive. Compared to my last video on the TurboGrafx 16, this one's definitely going to feel a lot less condensed at points. After all, there's so much more to talk about with this system, and there's also the fact that this is me talking about my personal favorite video game console. So even with my best job trimming and polishing the script, I have quite a lot to say about this system. Perhaps even too much. Keep in mind, I can't cover every little detail, event, or game from the Sega Genesis library, since this is meant to be a single abridged documentary and not a series. Sales figures from this era aren't 100% accurate either, as Nintendo and Sega were prone to talking up their own numbers and tearing down each other's. The main thing I want to focus on is sharing what made the system revolutionary and successful for its time, despite the uphill battles that Sega had to fight to make and maintain its status near the top of the peak. My name is Sherry, and I'll be your designated Talekeeper for today, as I delve into the rich, but also conflicted history of Sega's 16-bit bad boy console, the Mega Drive, also known as the Genesis. It's gonna be a wild ride from start to finish, and there might even be some blast processing involved. So make sure you've got some drinks and snacks on hand for this one. Without further ado, let's roll out.
インターナショナルビッグヒットゲームセガアウトランマーク3ソフトで新登場15コース5つのゴールスリルあふれるアップダウンコース選べるゲームサウンドセガアウトランゲームリーダー
Although the Mega Drive/Genesis was Sega's most famous and commercially successful home console, it wasn't their first foray into the industry, and to better understand its creation, it would help to briefly go over what happened with Sega's first console. In the decades following World War II, Sega, in all of their many forms and names, started as a manufacturer of coin-operated arcade and gambling machines in both the United States and Japan, before transitioning to electronic arcade cabinets in the early 1980s. So when companies like Atari, Coleco, and Mattel began to find success with home video game consoles, Sega was in a prime position to step into the burgeoning industry. Initially, Sega was interested in mass importing and distributing the ColecoVision in Japan, but when negotiations between the two companies went cold, Sega decided to release a platform of their own instead, the SG-1000, and its similar home computer counterpart, the SC-3000. In many ways, the SG-1000 system looked like a repackaged ColecoVision, being powered by the same 8-bit Zilog Z80 CPU and a modified Texas Instruments TMS-9918 video chip. But when its first model was launched in Japan on July 15, 1983, people weren't talking about Sega's new console, They were talking about the much more impressive machine that Nintendo launched on the exact same day, the Family Computer, or Famicom for short. No matter what Sega did with the SG-1000 series, including upgrades in the form of the SG-1002, the Sega Mark III, and the Sega Master System, they were always trailing behind Nintendo and the juggernaut that was the Famicom. This situation would be complicated even further between 1985 and 1987, when a business partnership between prolific developer Hudson Soft and computer powerhouse NEC would produce the PC Engine, the first home console of the fourth generation. With twice the graphical power and quadruple the processing speed of the Famicom, it was a genuine threat to both Sega and Nintendo, and its initial sales reflected that. But thankfully for Sega, their arcade cabinets were doing enough business to keep them financially steady, and with the company upgrading from their 8-bit System 1 and System 2 arcade boards to the far more advanced System 16 board, development on a console counterpart soon followed in late 1986. The project was codenamed Mark V, and it was led by a team of 8 key Sega engineers, including Hideki Sato, Masami Ishikawa, and Taku Matsubara. The keystone of the Mark V project was Sato's suggestion to include a Motorola 68000 microprocessor as its CPU. This was a chip whose power and reliability were reflected by its prominence within arcade cabinets and home computers alike, including the Commodore Amiga, the Atari ST, and the original Apple Macintosh. NEC and Hudson Soft's PC Engine may have billed itself as the first ever 16-bit console, but it was still being powered by an 8-bit CPU, so Sega believed that the inclusion of the Motorola 68000 would give their system a tremendous advantage, boasting better graphics and sound, plus a desktop-quality processor. For the console's audio capabilities, this would be split between 2 sound chips, a Yamaha YM2612 FM chip, and a Texas Instruments SN76489 PSG chip, previously used by the SG-1000 series. These 2 chips provided a combined 10 audio channels, which was 4 more than the PC Engine's Hughes C6280 and twice as many as the Famicom's Ricoh 2A03. The Yamaha YM2612 chip in particular produced its audio through a process called Frequency Modulation Synthesis, or FM-Synth, a method that was associated far more with arcade cabinets and synthesizer keyboards than it was with home consoles. This gave the system a very distinctively rich and contemporary sound, part of its goal in bringing the quality of arcades closer to home. The secondary PSG chip wasn't the only reused part either, as each Mark V console would also contain a Zilog Z80 coprocessor, which monitored the console's audio output, lowered the cost of production, and also allowed for backwards compatibility with SG-1000 games. While the final design would ultimately fall short of initial imaginings, the hardware of the Mark V project still managed to fit an impressive amount of potential into one machine while keeping it reasonably affordable, and this achievement helped provide the console with its official name, the Sega Mega Drive. As suggested by Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama, the word Mega was meant to represent its quality above the competition, and Drive was chosen to suggest the speed of its CPU for prospective developers and consumers alike. As one final touch, the design of its outer casing was handled by a separate team led by Mitsushige Shiraiwa, who found inspiration from audiophile equipment and stylish cars. The intent was to give the console a more mature appearance that would appeal to a broader and generally older audience, many of whom might have been put off by the toy-like appearance of Nintendo's Famicom, or NEC and Hudson Soft's PC engine, which some believed looked more like a floppy drive for a home computer than a proper console. And with that, the Sega Mega Drive had a name, a planned release date, and even several future expansions lined up. Its internal components and outer casing had been finalized and were ready for mass production, and it was even given one extra 16-bit in big gold lettering on the front to show off how powerful the console was. Everything was in order. All that was left was to hit the market.
ハマらない、そんな噂が飛び交ってるけど、それはソフトのせいじゃない。ハードに限界があったからだ。セガメガドライブ16ビット CPU 搭載。限界のバリアをぶち破って見せる、迫る、うなる。ビジュアルショック、スピードショック、サウンドショック。
時代が求めた16ビットセガメガドライブ。
The Sega Mega Drive was first released in Japan on October 29, 1988, with its launch titles being Super Thunderblade and Space Harrier 2, with Altered Beast arriving soon after. These three were specifically picked to show how well the console could adapt arcade games compared to its competition, and accompanying the launch was an ad campaign that presented the system as the herald of a new era, a space-age system that would break the monotony of the games industry and its outdated consoles with shocking results. So how did it go? Well, it was shocking, alright, just not the way Sega anticipated. Although Sega managed to sell all of its initial supply of 50,000 units within just 2 days, the total sales for its first year on the market were but a paltry 400,000. To put that into perspective, it took the Mega Drive its entire launch year to sell as many units as the PC Engine did within its first month on the market, or roughly as many units as the Famicom was selling every 3 months, despite being half a decade old at this point. The reasons for this were twofold. First, there was an entire year's gap between the release of the PC Engine and the release of the Mega Drive, which gave NEC and Hudson Soft ample time to soak up the new 16-bit console market for themselves. It didn't really matter that Sega's machine was more advanced. It wasn't the first one on store shelves, which only made the uphill climb steeper. Second, the Famicom was doing what it did best, and that was refusing to die, even in the face of competition with not one, but now 2 superior rival consoles. If you thought the SG-1000 releasing on the same day as the Famicom was bad, the Mega Drive came out just 6 days after Super Mario Bros. 3, a highly anticipated title that sold like gangbusters. The only game that sold more copies in 1988 was Enix's Dragon Quest III, which also debuted that year and was also exclusively on Nintendo's hardware. That was an absolute death sentence, and Sega would end 1988 looking like they were going 0 for 2 with their home console record. Even though there wasn't actually anything wrong with the Mega Drive, just unlucky timing.
Welcome to your doom.
The Mega Drive's poorly received launch might have also been a factor in the quiet cancellation of the floppy disk drive, an expansion that was widely hyped up ahead of release. This was because it was something the Sega Master System had long teased, but never received. And many believe that the floppy disk drive was a precursor for a console-compatible keyboard and mouse duo, which would have allowed the Mega Drive to function as a 16-bit home computer, not unlike the earlier SC3000, though it would have faced stiff competition from NEC's PC9800 series and ASCII's MSX2 on that front. A drawing tablet add-on was also shown in early promotional photos, but it too quietly disappeared after the underwhelming launch reception. But that wasn't the end of the console. Not by a long shot. I mean, just look at the remaining video length down there. We've got a whole lot more to go through. Despite the console's less than stellar launch, the Mega Drive would remain on shelves in Japan throughout the rest of the decade and the beginning of the next, largely being carried by its catalog of arcade ports and shoot-'em-up titles, which helped accrue a dedicated, alternative subculture of sorts around the console. It may have failed domestically, but Sega did have a major ace up their sleeve, and that was their prospects overseas. Thanks to their previous history with the SG-1000 series, they had a foothold in markets like Europe, Australia, and Brazil, as well as valuable connections across the Pacific Ocean in the United States. Just because Sega may have lost a battle didn't mean they had lost the console war. The Mega Drive was about to go global, and few could have guessed how much it was going to flip the script.
Late in the 20th century, terminal boredom fell upon the land. The maker looked down and said, "This is not good." And so it was. He brought forth Genesis, a system with twice the power, twice the challenge, twice the fun, with high-definition graphics and stereo sound. And the maker saw what he had done and said, "Now that's not bad. Discover Genesis, and your world will never be the same."
The Japanese debut of the Mega Drive was a stroke of bad luck for Sega, but the company was confident that their fortunes would be better overseas, announcing at the beginning of 1989 that North America would be the next market to receive the Mega Drive. North America was a massive and equally promising market, but it was also very different from Japan, and it didn't take long for Sega to run into several snags because of this. The first of these was over, of all things, the console's name. Sure enough, the name Mega Drive was already trademarked in the United States by Mega Drive Systems, a company that manufactured storage devices for home computers. The name was also personally disliked by Sega co-founder David Rosen. In its place, Rosen suggested calling it the SEGA Genesis, as it represented, quote, "a new beginning for the company." Sega's headquarters in Japan initially disliked the idea of changing the name, but begrudgingly accepted the revised Genesis branding, making it official ahead of the overseas launch. Issue number 2 was that Sega's American subsidiary did not have a marketing and sales department, which had previously led to the Sega Master System being distributed by, of all companies, Tonka. That's not a joke. Tonka Trucks had been asked to sell the Master System in North America after Sega decided to shift gears and focus on the Genesis. It went about as poorly as you think it did. Having learned from their mistake, or not, depending on who you ask, David Rosen chose to approach Atari for a distribution deal on Sega of Japan's behalf, meeting with both CEO Jack Tramiel and Electronics Division President Michael Katz to negotiate a partnership. Atari ultimately declined the offer, seeing the Genesis as too expensive of an investment and preferring to remain focused on their already successful line of home computers, leaving Sega to handle the console's launch themselves, while also expanding their American subsidiary. And of course, there was problem number 3, a 3-syllable word: Nintendo. Even with the more advanced hardware of the Genesis, it was still daring to enter a North American market where the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES, was not only popular, but riding high on its overseas apex. In 1988, the NES sold 7 million units in North America alone, and in 1989, it sold an even higher 9.2 million units by the end of the year. The catalog of new software from this period reflected the high demand, including Contra, Double Dragon, Super Mario Bros. 2, Ninja Gaiden, and Mega Man 2. With names like those, Sega had to do something bold to try and tip the scales in their favor, and the man with the plan was none other than Michael Katz, who had left Atari to become Sega of America's new president and CEO. Katz's strategy was to approach the market with a two-pronged pincer movement of sorts. First was to be aggressive with the console's advertising. Unlike Japan, Sega had the first next-gen system on North American shelves, and although NEC and Hudson Soft were close behind, they were still releasing a technologically inferior product for the same price, which played right into Sega of America's hands. Early commercial and print slogans like "Genesis does what Nintendo don't" and "We bring the arcade experience home" were not only snappy and memorable, they also emphasized putting gameplay footage of the Genesis side by side against the arcades, which were seen as the gold standard of quality at the time. Second was to counter Nintendo's grip on arcade-ported titles by using two equally recognizable forces from the American cultural canon: sports and celebrities. Now, sports games had obviously existed before the Genesis. In fact, some of the earliest video games, like Pong and Tennis for Two, were simulations of sports. But what made the Genesis different was the greater accuracy that 16-bit processing and graphics provided, as well as the growing emphasis on obtaining licenses from both leagues and player associations. You weren't just playing as a bunch of generic sleeve McDyckles from some anyplace USA that nobody gave a shit about. Now you could play as your favorite athletes and teams as you guide them to a championship like the backseat coach you regularly deny that you are. You could even play as the Hartford Whalers, the absolute meme team themselves, the Hartford Whalers, in 16 bits! You know what that means! Break out the brass bonanza! With Michael Katz's strategy ready and put into place, the Genesis would be officially released on August 14, 1989, in the test markets of Los Angeles and New York City. It was available in the rest of the United States by the end of the month, with a starting price of $199.99 US, roughly equivalent to $435 in 2021. Media coverage was certainly positive, and the situation looked promising, but the console was performing below expectations, only selling about 500,000 units during its launch year, when Sega's headquarters in Japan wanted a minimum of 1 million units to be sold by the start of 1990. But, to Katz's credit, the Genesis was outselling its immediate competitor, NEC's TurboGrafx-16, the North American version of the PC engine that had frustrated Sega of Japan so much the year before. Thanks in large part to Michael Katz's aggressive advertising policy, the TurboGrafx-16 would never outsell the Genesis, and would soon be relegated to obscurity in North America within the following 2 years. And even though the initial sales numbers weren't to Sega of Japan's liking, Michael Katz and his management still helped sow the seeds for future successes. For example, the emphasis on getting sports games for the Genesis would lead to a close partnership with Electronic Arts, a company that was about to hit it big with the duo of John Madden Football and Lakers vs. Celtics and the NBA playoffs, both released on the Sega Genesis in 1990. Yes indeed, this is where today's Madden NFL and NBA Live franchises got their start. Katz's leadership would also see the release of Michael Jackson's Moonwalker in the summer of 1990. Based on the movie of the same name from 1988 and featuring several fantastic conversions of MJ's hit songs, this was one of the first ever directly endorsed celebrity video games, and it happened to star one of the biggest names of the era, close to the height of his popularity. It wouldn't even be the only time that Michael Jackson would work with Sega either. The King of Pop was a big fan of Sega's games, and that connection would remain a highly influential one, well beyond the lifespan of the Genesis. Speaking of lasting well beyond the lifespan of the Genesis, few things are as big of a highlight from Michael Katz and his team as the Genesis Does ad campaign. It was catchy, it embodied the console's signature swagger, and it was pointed like a dagger to the heart of Nintendo's monopoly. Attack ads like these weren't really something you could get away with in Japan, but it worked incredibly well in North America. The fact that this one campaign is so synonymous with the Genesis/Mega Drive that Sega remade it 30 years later for the Genesis Mini says it all. Absolutely iconic. By the end of 1990, Sega had also released their new 16-bit console in most of Europe, as well as Brazil and South Korea. Even though North America would remain the focal point of the console for most of its lifespan, any discussion about the Mega Drive's overseas performance would be woefully incomplete without mentioning at least two of these three. So let's start with Europe. Although software for home computers was the dominant form of video gaming in Europe during the 80s and early 90s, the fourth generation of consoles would see rising success in the European market, with Sega in particular playing a major role in rocking the boat. NEC and Hudson Soft never officially launched the PC Engine/TurboGrafx-16 in Europe, while Nintendo were taking their time polishing the upcoming SNES, which meant that Sega had another opportunity to enter a large and influential market as the first 4th-gen home console. They'd even have the bold taglines in common, with Portugal and France rolling out "It's stronger than you" and "It's faster than you." Spain had Sega, the rule of the strongest, and the United Kingdom absolutely killed it with "To be this good takes ages." Unlike North America though, the Sega Master System was dominant over the NES in Europe, even after a few missteps during its launch in key places like the UK. But that didn't exactly translate into immediate success for the Mega Drive, because Europe and its many constituent nations were a less homogeneous market than Japan or North America, meaning that some countries were patiently waiting until the official launch to sell the Mega Drive, while others were mass importing and selling units and games from Japan, after crudely modifying them to be PAL compatible. And a few others, like Germany and Sweden, were already bastions for Nintendo. Once the Mega Drive did officially launch, it was a 16-bit console trying to compete against several 16-bit home computers that, while technologically weaker, could play games and do more for about the same price or even cheaper. So even though the Mega Drive had an advantageous head start in Europe, there was still a bit of work that needed to be done to get established and competitive against home computers. But hey, at least Sega got their system on store shelves, unlike the Conix Multisystem. Much like with Europe, Sega had previously established a foothold in the Brazilian market with the Sega Master System, thanks to a partnership with Tectoy, a local electronics manufacturer and video game development company based in Sao Paulo. You see, despite being the largest market in Latin America, and the Southern Hemisphere in general, Brazil was notorious for its high tariffs on imported video games, which often made any sort of expansion into the Brazilian market highly unprofitable, if not impossible. But thanks to Sega's partnership with Tectoy, they could get around Brazil's tariffs by having consoles and games manufactured locally. Not only that, but Tectoy also had permissions from Sega to market the Mega Drive both directly and indirectly in other Latin American countries, including Argentina, Uruguay, Chile, and even Guatemala. So it should come as no surprise that the Mega Drive was on track to develop an especially strong and much beloved reputation in Latin America. As for South Korea, it was a potential market that had a similar set of difficulties. Because of post-World War II tensions between Japan and the Korean Peninsula, electronics imported from Japan often had to be renamed and redistributed by a Korean company, and the Sega Mega Drive was no different. Rather than being sold by Sega directly, distribution rights were given to Samsung, who they had worked with before, and the console went by two different names in South Korea: the Super Game Boy prior to 1992, and the Super Aladdin Boy afterward. I would assume this was done to avoid legal conflict with Nintendo, even though the actual Game Boy had already been released in South Korea as the Hyundai Mini Comboy in late 1990. In any case, the relationship between Sega and Samsung wasn't as close-knit as their partnership with Tectoy in Brazil, and while the console's ultimate trajectory in South Korea was successful, it also wasn't as resonant like it was in Europe or Brazil. Back in Japan, the Mega Drive sought to bridge the gap with its competitors through experimentation, part of which involved flirting with the idea of online connectivity via the Mega Modem, an add-on that plugged into the system's expansion port and allowed a handful of compatible titles to be played over a phone line connection. Developed in tandem with Sunsoft, and originally planned to release close to launch, it didn't actually debut until 2 years later, in early November 1990. It was slow, even for its time, and didn't really prompt sales of the system, but it was revolutionary all the same, marking the first time that two console players could compete against each other without being in the same room, or even in the same building. The Mega Modem was scheduled to release in North America as the Telegenesis modem, complete with press coverage, but these plans were quietly cancelled after the modem was repeatedly delayed in Japan due to persistent bugs, something that Sega of America took as a sign that they were better off without it. It turned out to be the right call, given its failure in Japan, as well as how quickly North American consumers forgot about the planned add-on. But the Mega Modem is still worth noting because it showed that Sega of Japan was willing to take some pretty big risks to try and recover from the system's rocky launch. It wouldn't be the last time this would happen either, as Sega of Japan's aspirations for the Mega Drive would only grow larger as the system continued to find its success overseas. But the system's golden age hadn't happened just yet. It was over the horizon, ready to start in the final months of 1990.
Once you start playing Sonic the Hedgehog, everything else seems a little bit slow. Don't worry, I'll catch him.
Although the launch of the Sega Genesis in North America had fared better than the Mega Drive's debut in Japan, the second half of 1990 would see a sudden and dramatic change in command. Michael Katz's performance hadn't exactly impressed his superiors at Sega of Japan, especially CEO Hayao Nakayama, and in September 1990, after a particularly bad meeting between the two branches, Katz was terminated from his position as president and CEO of Sega of America. His replacement was Tom Kalinske, a businessman with prior managerial experience at Mattel and rival company Matchbox. Although he was largely unfamiliar with video games, Kalinske had an impressive track record with both revitalizing and initiating brands, and his leadership with Sega of America would quickly see an intensification of the console's aggressive advertising. A firm believer in the razor and blades business model, Kalinske's management slashed the price of the Genesis from $199.99 US to $149.99 in June 1991, and started numerous promotions in which prospective Genesis owners could purchase the console with additional starting games at a reduced price, or even for free. Some of these offers even gave consumers a choice between free starting games or a free power-based converter, which allowed the Genesis to play Sega Master System titles on cartridges or Sega cards, adding a little over 100 extra titles to the Genesis library through backwards compatibility. But Kalinske's team didn't just stop there. They wanted to make two more big moves that would boost Sega's influence over the North American market. The first of which was to get Sega of America involved in developing games made for and by Americans, which would bolster the console's library and provide more opportunities for non-Japanese developers. A key component in making the Genesis a friendlier console for international developers and publishers involved tackling the daunting barrier that was its dual audio chip setup. As exciting as the console's FM synth audio was, the actual process of writing music through frequency modulation synthesis is very complicated and delicate. And in the early 1990s, the process was largely unknown outside of Japan, so Sega of America commissioned San Francisco-based developer Recreational Brainware to create a computer program that would translate more traditional methods of music composition into something the Genesis could read and play. The Genesis Editor for Music and Sound Effects, or GEMS for short. The first games to use the GEMS sound driver debuted in mid-1991, and while its reputation would later become tarnished by an abundance of preset-reliant soundtracks, it was still an impressive piece of software, as well as the driving force behind several fantastic soundtracks too. Ultimately, GEMS would go on to be used for over 200 Western-developed titles, about a quarter of the base console's library. The other major decision from Tom Kalinske and his team was to switch the pack-in title that came with the Genesis. Although Altered Beast was an impressive port of a successful arcade game, it wasn't generating enough buzz and sales for Sega's liking. Instead, Kalinske and his team wanted to replace it with Sonic the Hedgehog, a colorful platformer with eye-catchingly fast gameplay, and a mascot embodying the cool attitude of the time. Kalinske's previous careers with Mattel and Matchbox gave him a good idea of what American kids liked, and Sonic, he believed, was exactly that. As it just so happened to be, the heads at Sega of Japan were looking for a new mascot to replace Alex Kidd, someone who could compete against Mario without looking like too much of a copycat. So both branches were in agreement on nominating Sonic to square off against Nintendo's Jolly Red Plumber. Sega of America was so confident in Sonic's potential, in fact, that they were willing to offer anyone who bought a Genesis before November 1991 a free copy of Sonic the Hedgehog sent by mail. Suffice it to say, this game could easily be the subject of its own video, so for the purposes of this one, I'll keep it down to just the essentials. Sonic the Hedgehog was a tremendous boon for the Genesis, quickly becoming the world's best-selling video game of 1991. Its success was largely carried by the North American audience that inspired Sonic's design and personality, and the character himself soon came to rival Mario and even Mickey Mouse in public recognition. Things were finally starting to click for Sega, and the results of the change in leadership from Michael Katz to Tom Kalinske were quickly reflected by the sales data. While Sega of America under Katz only sold 500,000 Genesis units in its debut year, Kalinske's management finished 1990 by selling over 1 million units, and another 1.6 million units were sold during his first full year in 1991. The numbers would only go up from there, because Sega had not only found their killer app, but also their definitive mascot. Sonic generated ample amounts of merchandise, had multiple sequels and spin-offs released within 5 years, starred in his own Saturday morning cartoon, and even became the first video game character to have a balloon in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade in 1993. All of that started here, with one Genesis game. Beyond North America, Sonic the Hedgehog had a resounding effect on the console's performance in Europe as well, being what many considered the first game that really showed off what the Mega Drive could do that home computers couldn't imitate. Accompanying similar price cuts to the console, Sonic the Hedgehog was made the new pack-in title in Europe as well, a combination that helped contribute to the nearly 1.2 million Mega Drives sold across the continent in 1991. Followed by another 3.6 million in 1992. This burst of success would not only sway influence away from home computers, but also attract partnerships with European studios, including Funcom from Norway and Novotrade from Hungary, but especially studios based in the UK like Core Design, Virgin Games, and Ocean Software, all of whom would develop and publish a large number of titles for the system. Even Japan would see an uptick in success because of Sonic, although it wasn't anywhere near as dramatic as the numbers in North America and Europe. Still, it helped drive home the point that Naoto Oshima and Yuji Naka's creation was exactly what the system needed to become a serious contender in the industry. There were plenty of other great releases around this time, like Sega's own Castle of Illusion starring Mickey Mouse, Musha by Compile, Decap Attack by Vic Tokai, and Aeroflash by ITL, but only the original Sonic the Hedgehog could claim the title of the best-selling game on the Genesis, as well as the game that sold the most systems. But of course, there's one more major development from 1991 that I have yet to mention, because Sega's growing success overseas was starting to make a certain other company realize that they couldn't rest on their laurels forever. And their next move would be the match that ignited the bonfire.
Gotta go. Hey, guy, you're the first serious gamer I've seen all morning. Check this out. Brand new 16-bit Super Nintendo with Super Mario World. Wow!
What's this one?
Oh, this is a Sonic the Hedgehog from SEGA Genesis. Hey, look at these radical colors, huh?
Wow, Sonic's fast, too.
No, over here.
I like Genesis, and it costs a lot less.
Wait, kid, that game
I'll
there.
take Sonic and Genesis.
I knew that.
Sonic the Hedgehog. More action, more speed. SEGA Genesis, it's a whole lot more for less.
After delaying the Super Famicom for a full year to make room for additional starting titles and wait for console production to become more affordable, Nintendo was finally ready to launch their highly anticipated 16-bit machine, and it hit the Japanese market on November 21st, 1990. It was an immediate and resounding success, because even though the PC engine was doing very well in Japan, it still wasn't strong enough to break the market away from Nintendo's Famicom, which was continuing to sell at least 1 million units annually until 1991. And since the Sega Mega Drive was trailing behind the PC engine, it came as no surprise that the Super Famicom took the Japanese market by storm as quickly as it did. Nintendo's brand loyalty was strong, and more people chose to wait instead of purchasing a console from a rival company. But North America was a different story. This was a market Nintendo was in danger of losing their grip on, so getting their new console shipped overseas was a high priority, one they'd fulfill in just 10 months. The Super Famicom launched in North America ahead of schedule on August 23, 1991, under the new name of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System, or SNES for short. But for all the pedigree Nintendo had overseas, the 16-bit console war did not start in their favor. Thanks to its nearly unopposed 2-year head start, lower price tag in a time of economic recession, Aggressive marketing campaigns, larger catalog of titles further enhanced by backwards compatibility, and the success of Sonic the Hedgehog in particular, the Genesis controlled the rivalry between 1991 and 1992, with Sega claiming it outsold the SNES 2-1 across the first year of competition. By January 1992, the Genesis held an incredible 65% share of the North American 16-bit console market, solidifying this as the first time that a modern Nintendo system had failed to win a majority stake in the region since December 1985. And while Sega already had a nearly tenfold lead on available titles, they weren't slowing down at all, with even more heavy hitters like Road Rash, Evander Holyfield's Real Deal Boxing, Golden Axe 2, Alicia Dragoon, Streets of Rage 2, NHLPA Hockey 93, Thunder Force 4, and even Sonic the Hedgehog 2, all being released for the Genesis during this period. Rivalry, as it turns out, was great for business, and the Genesis had somersaulted to 3.1 million total sales in North America at the end of 1991, a number that would double and then some to 7.6 million total sales at the end of 1992. Meanwhile, back in Japan, the Mega Drive was on track to end 1991 with over 2.5 million total units sold, which, for as bad as it was doing against the PC Engine and Super Famicom locally, was a number that sat roughly halfway between the console's performance in North America and Europe up to this point, even though the latter region would outpace it within the next year. In another attempt to shake up the market in their favor, Sega of Japan would release the Mega Drive's first major expansion on December 12, 1991, a compact disc player aptly named the Mega CD, or, as it would later become known in North America, the Sega CD. The add-on was the brainchild of Tomio Takami and a team of fellow engineers, who imagined it as something that would not only innovate, but also bring the Mega Drive/Genesis closer to its initial promises, with arcade-quality features like smooth sprite scaling and rotation being of particular importance. To accomplish this without affecting performance, the Mega CD would have to contain its own Motorola 68000 CPU, though the chip that was used was a more powerful and up-to-date variant than the one used inside the base console. The rest of its hardware involved a fair bit of trial and error, even more than the base console did back in 1986. But with a bit of technical assistance from JVC, Sega was able to make it work, not only with video games on CD-ROMs, but also audio CDs and CD plus Gs for multimedia application. Now, Sega was not an early adopter of the technology. The first CD-based peripheral for video games was the CD-ROM unit for the PC Engine, released in early December 1988, just months after the final standardization of the CD-ROM format. By the time Sega decided to ride the wave, Nintendo had brokered a deal with Sony, while NEC and Hudson Soft were already working on another greatly improved CD unit, the Super CD-ROM. Details regarding Nintendo and Sony's PlayStation add-on were scant, but Sega had an idea of what to expect from NEC's Super CD-ROM, and that's what they were reacting to. Sega of Japan was so paranoid about the possibility of details leaking to NEC, or Nintendo, that they largely worked on the Mega CD in secret, trying to make sure that it would look better than the Super CD-ROM when it launched, even though this attitude meant delaying the Mega CD and risking a higher price tag the more advanced it became. They even refused to send functional prototypes to Sega of America, and because of this, nobody except Sega of Japan and JVC knew what the Mega CD was capable of until it was publicly revealed at the June 1991 Tokyo Toy Show. During the reveal, representatives from Sega of America were present and unimpressed with their first look at the add-on and its planned lineup of starting software. saying that they wouldn't even consider bringing the Mega CD overseas until it had games that would appeal to a North American audience. This, despite the fact that at this point in time, the SNES was still a few months away from its overseas launch, and Nintendo had just shot themselves in the foot a week prior by revealing their partnership with Philips to produce another CD unit for their system. Sega of America's lack of enthusiasm for the add-on, in spite of that golden window of opportunity, wasn't exactly a sign of good fortune for the Mega CD, but Sega of Japan persisted, and the launch went on as scheduled. It was pretty par for the course. Considering how much Sega wanted to compete with NEC and Hudson Soft, the Mega CD was launched about 3 months after the PC Engine's Super CD-ROM, which could have been an advantage for Sega, because the Super CD-ROM didn't debut as an add-on, but as part of an entire full-priced console, the PC Engine Duo. I said could have, because NEC and Hudson Soft did release a standalone Super CD-ROM unit for previous models of the PC Engine, and it hit the market the very next day after the Mega CD debuted. It's almost a comedy of errors, isn't it? It also didn't help that the Mega CD suffered from a lack of first-party support at launch, with only 2 full titles by Sega in its first 6 months of existence, compared to the base console, which had 6 for its first half-year of sales. While there was a Sonic the Hedgehog game in development for the add-on, it wouldn't see completion until late 1993. And speaking of 3s, third-party support wasn't much better. Even companies as invested in the base console as Data East, Taito, and Namco didn't really take to the Mega CD as expected. If your guess was because they were already working on games for NEC, then you would be absolutely correct. You can go redeem this voucher backstage for a free Sonic Popsicle. Indeed, it didn't take long after launch for it to become clear that the Mega CD, much like the Mega Drive itself, wouldn't realize its full potential in Japan, but overseas. The North American release of the Sega CD was publicly announced at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in late June 1992. Sega of America was looking to release the add-on by the end of the year, later confirmed as November 11th, and the initial price tag was a hefty $299.95 US. That was a pretty big ask for consumers, but Sega of America promised that it would be worth the investment, because the Sega CD would have at least 20 titles at launch, and another 24 by the end of spring 1993. Not only that, but Sega of America was also promising to dedicate a third of its operations to the development of new CD games, clearly learning from the add-on's failure in Japan. Initial reception was actually quite positive despite the high price of the add-on, and Sega got enormous publicity from showcasing the Sega CD on Good Morning America as well as the Times Square Jumbotron. Sega of America CEO Tom Kalinske even created an outline detailing 5 different types of CD games and how to use them, as a way to help streamline and standardize the development process for new titles. Things were looking good, and the North American announcement of the Sega CD attracted the interest of several prospective developers, including none other than Sony, who wanted to open negotiations with Sega. To iron the details out, Tom Kalinske met with the head of Sony's American operations, Michael Schulhoff, and the president of Sony Computer Entertainment, Olaf Olafsson. Their proposal went like this. Sony had two game development studios in California that were both close to Sega and looking for work. Sony ImageSoft, a subsidiary in Santa Monica, and Digital Pictures, a business associate in San Mateo. Both were willing to produce games for the Genesis, the Game Gear, and the upcoming Sega CD, and because they were affiliated with Sony, that meant Sega could also benefit from having games based on popular films, with less of the hassle involved in obtaining the licenses. On the other side of the deal, Sony would gain valuable development experience as well as a cut of the profits. Both sides agreed to the deal, and the partnership was announced on May 20th, 1992, with some of the games that resulted including Sewer Shark, Bram Stoker's Dracula, Ground Zero Texas, Hook, and Night Trap. The partnership went so well, in fact, that both Sony and Sega of America wanted to take it a step forward, and at some point, the idea of a next-generation CD-based console was suggested, since the two held a very similar acrimony towards Nintendo. Both companies' American branches liked the idea, and several Sony executives back in Japan liked the idea, but when the final decision came to Sega of Japan, they shot it down, contemptuously believing that Sony didn't have the skills to develop video game hardware or software. Don't worry, I want to bang my head against a wall too. Losing a close partnership with Sony wasn't the only problem the Sega CD would run into either, as it didn't take long for the initial glitz and glamour of the add-on to wear off, revealing its many underlying problems. The starting price was too high for the average consumer, the add-on demanded the use of a separate AC adapter, its games tended to suffer from long loading times, and worst of all, its graphics were bottlenecked into the restrictions of the base console, which couldn't display more than 64 colors at once. While stylized games like Sonic the Hedgehog CD, Snatcher, Sylphied, and Popful Mail could reasonably get away with this, games that used full-motion video, which Sega of America banked on being a strong incentive for the add-on, looked terrible, even dated on arrival. It was kind of a shame, considering that several of these were actually pretty decent and enjoyable games. But the FMV graphics were unfortunately limited and poor compared to other forms of CD-based hardware that were available at the time, as well as arcade cabinets.
Freeze, sucker!
I give up! I give up! Don't shoot me!
And then there was just the plain and simple fact that Sega was paying the price for being late to the market and having to play catch-up. By 1993, home computers had started to embrace CD drives, the TurboGrafx-16 had already done so for years, and newer platforms like SNK's Neo Geo CD, the 3DO system, and Sony's PlayStation were quickly showing signs of vastly improved disc reading hardware and more detailed games. Sega of America would still support the add-on, even in other regions like Japan and Europe, but the Sega CD had become a very unusual and significant misstep for the company. 1992 had started with Sega dominating the North American market, but by the end of that year, cracks were beginning to show, and Nintendo was gradually picking up steam. For every Troubleshooter, Crew Ball, and Echo the Dolphin that Sega released, Nintendo fired back with their own Super Star Wars, Soul Blazer, and Super Mario Kart. There was still plenty of fight left in the Genesis, but the ordeal behind the Sega CD left a sour taste with many, including both major branches of Sega themselves.
The Sega Genesis has blast processing. Super Nintendo doesn't. So what's blast processing do? And what if you don't have blast processing?
1993 would begin with the continuation of another iconic phrase in Genesis advertising: blast processing. Adopted by Goodby Silverstein and Partners, the same advertising agency that created the Sega Scream and the Welcome to the Next Level campaign, blast processing was a catchy term with a vague meaning, a snappy way to say that the Genesis was a faster, and therefore better, console than the SNES, without actually explaining how. Now, in some regards, the Genesis actually was faster than the SNES. But according to Scott Bayless, a former producer and technical advisor at Sega of America, the term actually originated from a graphical trick that would allow the Genesis to display a 256-color image, quadruple its normal limit. But because of the technicality involved in doing this, no officially licensed games actually use the blast processing trick. If anything, it looked far more like a demo scene technique. But that didn't stop Sega's marketing associates from appropriating the term as something for consumers to parrot, especially in response to people saying that Nintendo's console was better. Blast processing wasn't the only change-up happening in 1993 either. At various points that year, Sega released an updated version of the console in all regions, typically referred to as the Mega Drive 2 or Model 2 Genesis, among other nicknames. Compared to the original release, the Model 2 had a more compact design, as well as a few minor alterations to the inner hardware that improved energy efficiency and made the system cheaper to mass produce, at the cost of having inconsistent audio quality from unit to unit. It also removed the headphone jack and volume slider on the front of the console because the Model 2 switched its AV ports from a choice of an RF coaxial or 8-pin DIN to a single 9-pin mini DIN, which natively supported stereo audio. I'm sorry to say, officially licensed promotional Sega Genesis speakers, but sometimes sacrifices have to be made for the natural convenience of progress. The Model 2 would also receive its own variant of the Mega CD/Sega CD unit, one that was positioned on the side of the console rather than underneath it. Much like the remodeled base console, the Model 2 Sega CD was a cost-efficient build with fewer parts at risk of breaking down, and it could even work with the Model 1 Genesis if need be. A lot of people prefer the more streamlined look of the Model 2 with its accompanying CD unit attached, and while I can certainly understand why, I'm personally a stickler for the Model 1 Genesis attached to the original CD unit. There's just something very aesthetically pleasing about those red and green status lights. Because it was made to be cheaper to produce without sacrificing the quality of gameplay, the Model 2 allowed Sega to put more systems on store shelves, making it a reasonably likely factor in the console's boosted influence over the course of the next 2 years. 1993 in particular was an especially fantastic year for the Mega Drive/Genesis, in most regions at least. A few of the notable new releases included Gunstar Heroes, the quintessential run-and-gun game of the era, Outrun 2019, which turned out to be a little overly optimistic in its predictions of the future, but still loads of fun, Pirates Gold, a title that still amazes me with its large open world and many things to do within it, surprisingly on par with its PC counterpart, NHL 94, one of the most acclaimed sports games of its time, and one with an active modding scene that continues to this very day, and of course, Mortal Kombat, with all the blood and gore from the arcade version that Nintendo was so afraid of, just one secret code away. You want a few more? There's also Shinobi 3, Ranger X, Shining Force, Disney's Aladdin, Blades of Vengeance, Rocket Knight Adventures, and Sonic the Hedgehog CD. Oh yeah, Sega fans were eating real good in 1993. Titles like these, and many more, absolutely drove hardware sales for Sega, even though Nintendo was quickly bridging the gap. In North America, the Genesis managed to sell nearly 6 million units in 1993, the single most successful year in the console's entire global history, bringing its regional sales up to 13.5 million total, almost double what it was the year before. Across the pond in Europe, the Mega Drive sold nearly 2 million units in 1993, though the system was starting to show signs of slowing down in hardware sales. Something that wasn't helped by the inconsistent availability of the Mega CD, Mega Drive 2, and Mega CD 2 from country to country. In Brazil, Nintendo managed to get the SNES released in 1993 through a distribution agreement with Playtronic, but it couldn't even put a dent in the Mega Drive's popularity, with Tectoy and Sega peaking at a domineering 80% market share in Brazil during the decade. And in South Korea, the Super Aladdin Boy had sold 194,000 units by the end of 1993, while its Nintendo-manufactured rival, the Hyundai Super Comboy, hadn't even sold half as many, with only 80,000 units being documented. As quiet as South Korea was compared to other markets, Sega was still winning there, and by quite an impressive margin. Really, the only region where it wasn't doing well was, where else? Japan, where the Mega Drive was still being outsold by the PC Engine 2-1, and by the Super Famicom nearly 4-1. The system broke 3 million total sales the year before, but it would never surpass 4 million during its official lifespan. Still, Japan was receiving its fair share of new titles, so even if sales were comparatively low, the library was no less illuminated for those who chose to embrace the Mega Drive and its dedicated subculture. Not everything in 1993 was to Sega's benefit, however. Starting that year, Nintendo was beginning to release SNES games with a hidden surprise inside the cartridge, the Super FX chip, a coprocessor made by Argonaut Software that allowed the console to display three-dimensional polygonal graphics in real time, while also having the capacity for scaling, rotation, and stretching effects with 2D sprites. And because it didn't require any sort of expansion to be plugged into the console, this came at no additional cost for consumers, a very clear jab at the Sega CD. The very first game to use the Super FX chip, Nintendo and Argonaut's own Star Fox, or Star Wing as it was known in Europe, quickly became one of the best-selling games of 1993, and the Super FX chip would see similarly impressive implementation in other games, like Stunt Race FX in 1994 and Super Mario World 2 Yoshi's Island in 1995. 1993 would also see the release of the first natively 32-bit home consoles, starting in February with the Japan-exclusive FM Towns Marty by Fujitsu, and then continuing on with the Commodore Amiga CD32 in September, the 3DO system in October, and the Atari Jaguar in November, effectively marking the beginning of the fifth generation of consoles, something that would soon apply pressure to the big boys on the global market. And then at the end of the year, Sega was called to testify before members of the United States Congress in an important hearing on the perceived dangers of violence and sexual content in video games. This was part of a much larger reactionary pushback that started with the music industry in the 80s, and then moved on to television and video games in the 90s. For video games specifically, the congressional hearings were organized by Senators Joseph Lieberman of Connecticut and Herbert Kohl of Wisconsin, both Democrats. Their purpose was simple: to either prompt the creation of an independent moderating body for video games, or else have the government step in and regulate the medium themselves. The senators' decision would be based on testimony from advocacy and research groups, followed by testimony from Howard Lincoln representing Nintendo and Bill White representing Sega. It's here where I should point out that Sega had already implemented their own rating system earlier in 1993, but many felt it was too vague and too coincidentally timed with the growing moral panic over video games. It also wasn't independent, because Sega themselves created it and oversaw its application, while Nintendo refused to use it and instead relied on their strict take-it-or-leave-it content policies. In fact, rather than working together to make their case for the good of the industry, Howard Lincoln used the platform to throw Sega under the bus for their comparatively laissez-faire attitudes. 3 specific games were at the center of the hearings. Midway's big arcade hit, Mortal Kombat, which was toned down on the SNES but uncensored on the Genesis, Konami's Lethal Enforcers, whose SNES version still used the revolver-shaped Justifier accessory, but saw much of the violent details censored out, and Digital Pictures' Night Trap, which was never available for the SNES, allowing Nintendo to dodge some of the most scathing criticism from the hearings. As such, Sega was subjected to the brunt of the congressional hot seat, made even worse by Nintendo's dogpiling, but the ultimate conclusion was that the industry would be held to regulate itself through a more concise and independent ratings board, which we know today as the ESRB. Getting a common rating system was necessary for the medium in the long run, but the way the hearings played out on C-SPAN meant that Sega took a decent hit in the process, with several stores removing titles like Night Trap and the Genesis version of Lethal Enforcers from their shelves entirely, despite newfound interest from consumers. Digital Pictures formally objected to the hearings, saying that much of the criticism towards their game was created by removing the context of its premise and inspiration. Night Trap was supposed to be an over-the-top parody of vampire movies, where your job was to protect the women in the building by trapping vampires with goofy Home Alone-style devices, not actively try to torture and kill them. But that wasn't how the American public would remember it.
But I was wondering if maybe you had seen my boat.
Your boat?
My boat? Boat! Oh! My boat, ain't it a beauty? Is everything all right here, hey? Those shades at night, eh?
Yeah, well, will there be anything else, sir?
Ultimately, 1993 would become emblematic of the shifting dynamic in the console wars, with Nintendo gaining the upper hand as Sega's edgier approach was meeting new consequences. 5 years had already passed since the Mega Drive debuted in Japan, and although the system was still popular with software developers, technology had advanced considerably within that half-decade, and Sega would soon be expected to make an important decision, either adapt the Genesis accordingly, or move on to the next system. Unfortunately, the road ahead was not a smooth one, because as much as I love this console, even I have to come to terms with the fact that its final years were anything but the send-off it deserved.
For those who purchased something other than a Sega Genesis.
Yeah, that's it.
Our sincere condolences.
What a waste.
When you start with a Genesis, you can always add a Sega CD. And new Genesis 32X. Everything else is cold and stiff.
Burial or cremation?
Burn it.
Welcome to the next level.
The period between 1994 and 1995 was, without a doubt, the most bizarre sequence of events in the lifespan of the Mega Drive/Genesis. Potentially even Sega's history as a first-party console manufacturer. As the 90s reached their halfway point, it was clear that the market was moving on from the 16-bit days of the fourth generation. NEC and Hudson Soft had discontinued the PC engine to launch the PC-FX, Atari was mounting a comeback with the first home console under their new Big Cat theme, and a twice-betrayed Sony was making their debut with the PlayStation. Sega, on the other hand, was having a bit of a wild time experimenting with the Mega Drive/Genesis while it still had life left in it, before committing to the idea of preparing a successor console. Like, sure, this was the year that saw phenomenal and even iconic releases like Sonic the Hedgehog 3, Castlevania Bloodlines, Dynamite Headdy, Contra Hard Corps, and Shining Force 2, at least outside of Japan. But then there were the weirder, more experimental moves that Sega was making around this time. There was the Sega VR headset, which was widely anticipated to release in 1993, but was pushed back to 1994 before being quietly cancelled that same year over health concerns from prolonged use of the headset, especially among children. There was also the short-lived debut of the SEGA Genesis CDX, also known as the Sega Multi-Mega, a novelty model of the system that fused the base console and the Mega CD/Sega CD into one machine, while also doubling as a portable, battery-powered CD player. Sure, it would probably look really silly going out for a walk and listening to music on this, and it wasn't the first attempt to fuse the base console and CD unit, considering that the expensively stylish JVC Wonder Mega released 2 years prior, but you have to admit, it's still pretty cool to see something like this. Speaking of novelty models, this was also around the time that Sega partnered with Japan Airlines to create the Mega Jet, a semi-portable Mega Drive that would plug into an airplane seat, allowing passengers to play a pre-selected group of games to pass the time during their flight, or even bring their own cartridges on board if they wanted to. Although it was originally made for air travel, the Mega Jet was also sold in stores, albeit in limited quantities, since it would work with any sort of car that had an internal television screen. More notably, the Mega Jet would serve as the basis for the Sega Nomad, a fully portable Genesis model that was exclusive to North America, but unlike all these other examples, the Nomad came out in autumn 1995, so I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Hold on just a moment, let me refocus. Getting back on track, 1994 also saw the launch of the Sega Channel, a subscription service that allowed Genesis and Mega Drive owners to download games into the temporary memory of a special adapter cartridge, receiving said data from either a satellite or a computer network that was then transmitted to the adapter through an RF cord attached to a cable TV box. Now, the Sega Channel wasn't the first online subscription service for home consoles, as the idea had already been pioneered between 1979 and 1981 by PlayCable, a service for the Mattel and Television. In 1983, there was the equally ill-fated GameLine service for the Atari 2600. Even Nintendo tried to experiment with early online connectivity when they released the Famicom Net system in 1988. And of course, we already mentioned Sega's own Mega Modem earlier, but what made the Sega Channel different from all of those was that it was the first successful attempt to execute the idea, as it provided access to games that hadn't received physical releases or were otherwise difficult to find, especially in North America, where the service was most popular. Some of these titles included Capcom's Mega Man: The Wily Wars, Alien Soldier by Treasure, and Pulseman by Game Freak. Yes, that Game Freak. But out of all of these experimental moves, only one was on track to become the official second major expansion for the system. Though unlike the Mega CD/Sega CD, this one would be making its debut in North America, not Japan. The Sega 32X. Oh god. Whereas the Sega CD was largely a reaction to NEC and Hudson Soft, the 32X was a reaction to Atari, whose new Jaguar console was perceived as a threat to Sega's hold on the North American market. Yes, the Jaguar. Also the Neo Geo CD and 3DO, but mainly the Jaguar. Even though Atari advertised the Jaguar as a 64-bit system, it was a complicated and difficult platform to develop software for, so most titles were actually 32-bit, but that was still twice as powerful as the Sega Genesis and Nintendo's SNES, and that was enough to make Sega of Japan feel nervous about sharing the market with new and more advanced competition. Reacting swiftly, Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama stated that all branches of the company needed to invest in a 32-bit upgrade, though there was significant pushback from Tom Kalinske and Sega of America. who believed that the Genesis was doing perfectly fine on its own, and it very clearly was, but you should know by now that the bigwigs at Sega of Japan were the ones in charge, so the dialogue continued on. Initial discussions of the 32X were led by Hideki Sato of Sega of Japan and Joe Miller of Sega of America, where it was first suggested that it would be an enhanced model of the Mega Drive with double the normal color limit, not unlike NEC's PC Engine Super Graphics. But Miller objected, saying that such minimal changes would be wasteful and that the idea would be better as an add-on that could be inserted into the cartridge slot, looking to the earlier power-base converter for inspiration. After much deliberation, his Japanese counterparts reluctantly agreed and put Sega of America in charge of development with a tight deadline, since they clearly had so much to say about it. It was codenamed Project Mars, the first of the company's many planet-themed ventures conceived in 1994. The other three, codenamed Sega Jupiter, Sega Saturn, and Sega Neptune, would all be developed in Japan, but only the Saturn would ever see a retail release, having shifted in vision to become a separate, next-generation console. The 32X was unveiled to the general public at the Summer Consumer Electronics Show in late June 1994, though journalists got to see it 3 weeks earlier at a private event. At both showings, it was promoted as something that would satiate Genesis owners until the Saturn was ready to launch, but reception was, well, not very good. Despite Sega of America's promises for the add-on, many key developers had already moved on and were more interested in the Sega Saturn, while industry insiders questioned why the 32X even existed, a grim omen for its coming release, and one not too dissimilar from the Mega CD before it. Because Sega of Japan had demanded the 32X be ready in time for the all-important holiday season, the add-on was crunched to completion, releasing on November 21st, 1994. The launch followed a massive $10 million ad campaign that showcased the 32X's increased processing power and polygonal 3D graphics, all while being absolutely horny on main. The starting price tag was $159.99 US, which cost more than a typical Sega Genesis bundle at this point, and unlike those offers, the 32X did not include a pack-in title. The weeks leading up to release actually went better than you might have thought, with orders for the 32X outnumbering the initial stock and decent praise coming in from the gaming press. Sega would even boast that the 32X outsold one of their 32-bit console competitors, the 3DO system, within 2 months. But it also didn't take long before problems started to emerge. In Japan, Sega released the Saturn just 1 day after the 32X came out in North America. So when news reached the other side of the Pacific, many consumers chose to save their money to buy a Saturn instead of a 32X. This not only stunted sales in North America, but also Japan and Europe, where the 32X was released after the Sega Saturn's debut in its home market, further putting into question why anyone would want to buy a 32X when they could just hold out for the more powerful Saturn instead. This resulting confusion gave ample leverage to Nintendo, who made the decision to release Donkey Kong Country in North America on the same day as the Sega 32X. Donkey Kong Country was a smash hit, breaking numerous sales records during the 1994 holiday season, and its pre-rendered 3D graphics are still regarded as some of the most advanced and impressive that the SNES was capable of displaying. And none of it required an add-on that cost $160, or even the Super FX chip. Of course, Sega still had a recent blockbuster of their own to fall back on, that being Sonic & Knuckles, a continuation of Sonic the Hedgehog 3, but the timing of Donkey Kong Country's North American release seemed like it was all but targeted to crash the party for the 32X's launch. Then in January 1995, the annual hangover of the holiday season, there was a spike in customers going to stores to request a refund for their 32X, with 10% of North American units being returned that month alone. The main issue was installation. Although the advertisement said to just stick it in your Genesis, the actual process of setting up a 32X was much more involved than that. Just like the Sega CD, the 32X couldn't share power with the base console, and thus required its own bulky AC adapter. It also had to be connected to the Genesis by an AV link cable, with a secondary AV out port to connect the 32X, not the Genesis, to the television. Not only that, but the 32X came with 2 electromagnetic shield plates, which needed to be attached to the doors on the base console's cartridge slot. And if it was being attached to a Model 2 Genesis, a spacer would have to be added to the bottom of the 32X, or else it wouldn't be stabilized, risking a sudden disconnect during play. Improper setup would cause games to malfunction, and there were even allegations that the 32X could permanently damage both cartridges and systems if it wasn't installed correctly. Regardless of how true these claims actually were, it was enough to scare many consumers away from the 32X. People also started to realize the lackluster reality of its early titles, which were very clearly rushed to completion alongside the add-on itself. The 32X version of id Software's Doom garnered particular infamy for its lack of content and poor audio quality, while Almanac and ALU's Cosmic Carnage was almost withheld from public release because Sega of America was ashamed of the final product. It also didn't help that a select few games were labeled as Sega CD 32X, meaning that they required both the Sega CD and the 32X in order to play. And the expensive, viscerally unpleasant look of the system with both expansions attached and wired showed just how much of a mess the console had become because of the gradual breakdown in communications between Sega of Japan and Sega of America.
Over there. I hear something.
Sega of America would try to salvage the 32X by bringing back the Sega Neptune proposal that combined the Genesis and 32X into one machine, but the damage had already been done, and the plan was scrapped soon after a prototype was made. By early 1995, the Sega Saturn was getting ready to launch overseas, while interest in the 32X was nosediving, as was its price tag, with the add-on being slashed from $159.99 US to $99.99, and then a poetically tragic 1995 by the end of the year. And if you thought things couldn't get any worse, this was the same year that Sega of Japan made the calamitous push to have the Saturn release in North America 4 months ahead of schedule, without properly informing retailers, developers, or publishers. In the span of just one E3 speech, the gap between the 32X and the Saturn shrank by a third of a year, and it made Sega look dishonest and greedy in the eyes of consumers. Months later, in October, Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama called for the termination of service for all of Sega's remaining 3rd and 4th generation platforms, so that the company could focus entirely on the Saturn. Realistically, though, Nakayama's command mainly ended the Mega Drive in Japan, a market where it never managed to outsell either of its rivals, and gave all branches of the company a slightly less embarrassing outlet to snuff out the 32X and Mega CD/Sega CD worldwide. But it made for a sobering realization. In the span of just over a year, Sega's poor decision-making had managed to break the signature edge that defined the identity of the Genesis/Mega Drive, as well as damage their credibility with developers and consumers. This fracture in trust would be an unremitting problem for the Sega Saturn, even prompting Tom Kalinske to resign from Sega of America in late 1996, and it was a very unfortunate chapter to close the history of the Mega Drive on. But even as both major branches of Sega embarrassed themselves over the 32X and Saturn debacle, developers were able to alleviate some of the bitterness that stained the conclusion of the Genesis/Mega Drive's run on the market. Sales may have been naturally declining as people were moving on to the next generation, but there were still a few standout titles at the end of the ride. Nextech's Crusader of Senti, also known as Soleil or Ragna Senti in other regions, was part of a larger effort to show that the Genesis could offer its own exclusive role-playing games, including action RPGs, and, personally speaking, it's one of my favorite games for the system. Yes, I know it originally released in Japan in 1994, but I like it. So shush. Comix Zone, made by Sega's American development studio, the Sega Technical Institute, provided a great side-scrolling beat-em-up experience with the inventive twist of being set inside a comic book, with each of its stages being the literal pages and panels comprising it from cover to end. Blue Sky Software's Vector Man sought to accomplish for the Genesis what Donkey Kong Country did for the SNES, and while its sales were hardly even close, it still stands as one of the console's most technically impressive games with some of its most experimental sound design, courtesy of techno-musician John Holland and the GEM sound driver. And to name just one more, there was Sega's own Rystar, which found a way to repurpose an early development concept for Sonic the Hedgehog, being a simple and straightforward platformer built around Rystar's ability to reach out and grab things. It's one of the system's best and most accessible titles, easy to pick up, and even easier to enjoy. Outside of Japan, the Genesis/Mega Drive would still receive support in 1996 and 1997, largely from developers and publishers who still had one or two projects left to finish before moving on to the 5th generation, but a handful were dedicated to seeing the console to its very end, chief of which was none other than Electronic Arts. In stark contrast to the criticism of today's EA, there was something admirable about their send-off to the Genesis, which included one more entry in nearly all of their popular sports franchises, for people who didn't have the latest and greatest console just yet. FIFA 97, Madden NFL 98, NHL 98, and NBA Live 98 were some of the last official titles for the system, and they were all released within an 8-month period. Europe would receive its last officially licensed title in October 1997, Appaloosa Interactive's The Lost World: Jurassic Park, while the final North American release for the system came a year later, in October 1998. Frogger, based on the arcade game by Konami and ported by Morningstar Multimedia and Majesco. Some might see this as a quiet and underwhelming end for the system, and that's certainly valid, but the poetic side of me sees something a little more special in this. Sega of Japan and Sega of America might not have agreed on much, but one thing they did have in common was advertising the Mega Drive/Genesis as a system that would bring the arcades into the home. So don't you think it was kind of fitting that the last official title for the Genesis was an arcade game? With Japan, Europe, and North America out, that only left Brazil, where Tectoy assumed direct management of the console after Sega themselves had moved on to the Saturn, and, not long after, the Dreamcast. Tectoy would distribute those systems too, but the Mega Drive was still massively popular, lasting longer in Brazil and other parts of South America than any other region. And a big part of that was because Tectoy not only worked to translate a number of Mega Drive titles into Portuguese, they also developed a few games of their own, including Férias Frustradas do Pica-Pau in 1996, a Mega Drive port of Duke Nukem 3D in 1998, and Show do Milhão 2, based on a popular game show and released in 2002, making it the console's definitively final official release. I'd like to repeat that for emphasis. Thanks to the Brazilian market, there were official Mega Drive games being released as far as 2002, 14 years after the hardware running it was made, and happening not only in a different century, but also after Sega themselves had retired from making consoles. It's fascinating and less often discussed stories like these that make me really happy to have a platform to share it with you all. And thank you, Brazil, for for giving the system a better send-off than it had elsewhere.
10 mil reais, vamos ver. Qual é a resposta certa? Está certo disso? Certa resposta. Vamos para a pergunta que vale 20 mil reais. Vamos ver.
So, after detailing the console's conclusive years in Japan, Europe, North America, and finally Brazil, that was everything and the system was finally done, right? Well, not quite. Tectoy's continued support in Brazil wasn't the only thing keeping the console going after Sega themselves had moved on to try and salvage the Saturn. Let's dial things back to 1998. Although Sega of America may have ended their official support for the Genesis, plenty of its games were still on store shelves, and some potential consumers had missed the console entirely. To help make the best of this situation, Sega of America signed an agreement with Majesco Entertainment to license an affordable, third-party model of the system, usually referred to as either the Genesis 3 or the Model 3 Genesis. Compared to its first-party predecessors, the Model 3 was a bare essentials version of the system and not much else. It was made to be small, compact, and cheap, though this came with the afterthought of the system not being weighed down, meaning it's easy to accidentally pull the Model 3 by its controllers during play. And because of its bare-bones design, it was incompatible with the Sega CD, the 32X, the Power-Base converter, or any game that used external processors, like Virtua Racing. But that was simply because of what it was made to be, a clearance-price Genesis produced with only the base console's library in mind. However, through their production and sales of the Model 3, Majesco was able to keep the Genesis at least somewhat relevant in North America while the Saturn was being replaced by Sega's next, and final, home console, the Dreamcast. Between Majesco and Tectoy's efforts to prolong the console after Sega themselves, it said something quite poignant about the system's popularity. For many hardcore Sega nuts, the Mega Drive/Genesis represents the golden age of the company that they wish Sega could go back to. And believe me, I understand that mentality. But for as much as I love this console and have my bias show from time to time, part of making this retrospective meant having to accept that it had more than just a few problems, many of which were rooted in the gradual disagreements and breakdowns in communication between Sega of Japan and Sega of America. It can be easy to point fingers at Sega of Japan for their oftentimes reactionary and terrible decision-making, but don't forget that they were also the ones who saw a reliable leader in Tom Kalinske and let him operate Sega of America with a higher degree of independence than his predecessors, which was critical to their success. And Sega of America wasn't perfect either. There were times when they could have been more assertive when saying no to their superiors in Japan, especially with the leverage they had from being the most successful market. In a way, the Mega Drive/Genesis simultaneously represented Sega at their best and Sega at their worst. That relationship wasn't one of those simple things you could just go back and change like some sort of alternate history scenario. For better or worse, that's all in the past, and try as we might, we can't change it. What we can do, however, is reflect on what it achieved in spite of its difficulties. As you may recall from earlier in this retrospective, Sega of Japan initially advertised the Mega Drive as a console that would shock life back into the industry through its advanced hardware. And while that didn't exactly pan out in Japan, it absolutely shook up the industry overseas. Being the debut console of the fourth generation in both North America and Europe was exactly what Sega needed to convince the public how impressive its new 16-bit system truly was, as was their more dominant success over Nintendo in markets like Brazil and South Korea. Beyond the aggressive advertising that largely defined the console's identity overseas, Sega of America also made significant efforts to encourage more non-Japanese developers and publishers to get involved with home consoles. with names like Blue Sky Software, Electronic Arts, and Traveler's Tales all getting considerable fame because of the Genesis. And for reasons like these, it's a pretty sound argument to say that the Genesis was largely responsible for revitalizing the console development scene in North America after the video game crash of 1983, as well as convincing numerous European developers to swing from home computers over to consoles. While the Sega Mega Drive/Genesis wouldn't have a catalog of titles nearly as massive as its Nintendo-made rivals, it still had over 1,100 games to choose from, and I have no shortage of favorites from its library, including a few from the Sega CD and the 32X. To such an extent that it's genuinely difficult for me to narrow that down to 10 or even 20. For that matter, I've already mentioned or shown clips from most of them too, so here's some footage from Devilish the Next Possession while I try to regain my train of thought here. Ultimately, my hesitancy to name a handful of favorite games ends up working as an oddly succinct way to summarize my feelings towards the Mega Drive/Genesis, as well as the opportunity of putting a video like this together. This 16-bit maverick of a console has so many more interesting stories attached to it. To name a few examples, I didn't bring up the Menacer light gun that was effectively Sega's answer to Nintendo's Super Scope, how Nintendo's Super Game Boy player was another blow to Sega's Genesis and Game Gear in 1994, or the controversy between Sega and Accolade over the latter sidestepping the official licensing process for their games, something that Sega of America was willing to take them to court over. Indeed, because of its longer lifespan and greater success/relevancy within said lifespan, there's far more to the history of the Sega Genesis than there was with the TurboGrafx-16. So I knew I was walking into a longer and more difficult topic to condense, but I really tried to pour my heart into this one, for the console I'm always happy to say is my personal greatest of all time. Now that I've covered NEC and Hudson Soft's PC engine/TurboGrafx-16 and Sega's Mega Drive/Genesis, the logical thing to do would be to talk about SNK's Neo Geo next, since it was chronologically third in line, but part of me has also flirted with the idea of talking about Atari's innovative, but lesser discussed, rivals during the second generation. Or maybe one of the many 8-bit or 16-bit home computers from the era before Microsoft and Apple's operating systems became the industry standard. Off the top of my head, the Commodore Amiga was a popular platform for developing Genesis games, which helps to explain why so many Amiga games were also available on the Genesis, but at this point, this is all trivial rambling. Just keep an eye peeled and see what results. For the time being, I think I've said quite enough. So thank you for taking the time to watch all the way through, do your best to keep yourself healthy and safe, and until next time, take care.